Alrighty. So I think I've got everything up now. Let's get started. So we were learning yesterday in the Biurim that when you're destroying something for constructive purposes, such as so we talked about you're not obligated to eat leftovers and to just because it's good. You have, if there's a constructive reason why you need to discard the food, it could either be for economic reasons or it could be because you want something fresher. So then there is justification to destroy food and you're not in violation of Bal Tashchis. Okay? And the next halacha that we'll see, I just want to make sure that we've exhausted this discussion in this sif. Okay, it seems that way. All right, so he says, so when do we say that when you spoil or destroy something wantonly, you're in violation of Bal Tashchis, which is both for food and for any other utility item? I just go ahead and I take a baseball bat and I whack a whole bunch of vases, okay? That's also Bal Tashchis. So, in other words, being wantonly destructive is Bal Tashchis. So, Bamed Dvarim Amurim Kisha'osa Derech Hashchata V'Kilkul. He says that's only true when you're doing it in a destructive way, in a way that ruins the item. Aval almenat litakein mutar lekalkel. But let's say your objective in being destructive is to be constructive. So then you would you would like to demolish a building in order to build something new. So if there's no other way to avoid that, so then you're allowed to be destructive. Kegon ilan ma'achal shemakhisha sakarka umazik ilanos acherim hatoivim imenu. Here's one example in agriculture. Let's say you have a fruit tree. We know the Torah says don't destroy the fruit trees when you go out to war. But let's say it's one fruit tree in the orchard that is harming the other surrounding trees that are actually better in quality or more desirable to you than that other fruit tree. Okay? So then you're allowed to uproot a fruit tree in order to be constructive to the other trees in the orchard. Okay? Or let's say there's a fruit tree and you need to build a house or something else. So then you're allowed to uproot the tree. You're allowed to be destructive for constructive purposes. Or even if, let's say, you have a tree that is blocking the sunlight from coming into your house. So then mutar lakatzitzo, you're allowed to chop down the tree. Let's say you have a fruit tree that has very valuable wood, and you'd like to use that wood for lumber, but it means destroying the tree. That's also permitted, even though it's a fruit-bearing tree. He says the same would apply to all other kinds of things. The example is only being given for trees, but it would really apply to any other item as well. And it certainly goes without saying that if you're being destructive to an item in order to repair that item, the very same item, so then that would, of course, be permitted as well. Kagon, shesoref kisei v'shulchan, litakein gufo does not mean, I mistranslated. Litakein gufo means to help yourself. If you want to be destructive to an item in order to benefit yourself, your own person, so then that's certainly permitted. And what's the example? Kagon, shesoref kisei v'shulchan lihischamein bahem im ein lo eitzim acherim. Let's say it's in the middle of the winter and the heat, there's no heat. I can only imagine what some Ukrainians must be going through right now. And let's say they have no firewood, and so they need to take furniture in order to warm up. So that you would be allowed to do. You'd be allowed to actually burn tables and chairs if you have no other source of fuel for heating. That would be permitted. Let's see, where did I? Soref beged L'chasos dam be'efer kedei sheyuchal l'shachto la'achlo im en lo afar acher. Or here's another example. Let's say, and he says, kagon sholech basfina. Let's say you're on a trip on a boat, and you want to shech the chicken. What do you need to do? You need a knife. You need a chicken. What else do you need? You need dirt. Why? What's the need for dirt? You need to
cover the blood.
You need to do kisodam. So you can either use sawdust, you can use dirt, you can use ash, but the Torah says you need to cover the blood, right? So let's say you're on a boat, you have no earth available. But what you do have is you have a bed sheet that you don't need. And if you burn it, you'll get the ash from the bed sheet, and you'll be able to use that ash for kisoy hadam or any other kind of fabric. He says that's justifiable as well. All other examples where it's not bal tashchis is where it's true, you're destroying the item in question, but it's for a constructive purpose, and therefore it's okay. Okay, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Livnos sham, you uproot a tree because you need to build on that spot. Yesh omrim the dafka livnos sham olatakin b'makomo davar hanitzrach lo. So some opine that this is only true if you need the exact place where the tree is to build. Masha'en ken im zarak laharchiv chatzero uletzorach tiyul o tosefet or berevach ba'al malo. But let's say you're not interested in building on that spot, but you just want to have an expanded open space. So he says there are poskim who would say, and again, this is something that needs to be deliberated over. There are some poskim who would say that that's not enough of a justification to uproot a fruit tree. He quotes the Chavos Yoyer, Rav Yair Bachrach, who suggests this, that just having a little bit more open space in your yard, you want to uproot the lemon tree. I come from California, everyone's got lemon trees. In Israel too, I just stayed with someone who has lemon trees. Citrus fruits grow very well in desert climates. So that's why Israel is known for its oranges also. So he says, let's say you have a tree in your backyard, and your kids want to use the play yard to, let's say, to play catch, and the tree's in the way. They want to play basketball or something like that, or play hockey, right? Street hockey. So you would not, according to this opinion, you would not be allowed to uproot the tree that's blocking the space. It's only if you want to build on it, then we can justify it. So it's a machlokes. We're not saying halachically absolutely aser, but it's just a consideration. Okay, shema fil ala chalon mutar lekatzitzo. We also said that if it's blocking the sunlight from getting into your house, you're also allowed to chop down a tree. V'im efsher yiksotz raket anafim bilvad hamafilim alav v'lo yiksotz et gufa. However, he says if it's possible to just trim the tree and remove the branches without completely destroying the tree, that would be preferred, right? So you've got a tree that's blocking your window, you can cut it. You don't have to completely uproot it. You can trim it and cut it down to the bare minimum, and eventually it'll grow again. And in a few years, you'll have to trim it again. That would be preferred halachically because it's a fruit tree. He says, even though that involves a little bit more effort, because it would be so much easier to just uproot the tree, but that's not enough of a that extra effort to regularly trim the tree every few years is not enough of a justification to allow us to do something which he says it could be even a sakana, because if a person is oiver and bal tashchis, he could bring harm to himself. And it's also a mitzvah lo saseh. The Torah says don't wantonly destroy things. So if you can avoid destroying things, even though it may be added tircha at some point in the future, that's preferred. Okay. Lihit chameim, if you need to burn chairs and tables in order to warm yourself and you have no other kindling, he says, ayin biurim. He says, I refer you to the biurim, which we'll see in just a moment. And then osoref beged, or you can burn a piece of fabric in order to do kisui hadam. V'im lo shaveh ha'of kehefsed habeged sheyisrof le'efer. He says, the case that we were giving, the example was you have a chicken and you have to do kisui hadam. So you burn the piece of fabric so that you can do kisui hadam because you're on a boat. He says, what if the chicken is not as valuable as the piece of fabric? The piece of fabric that you have is an Armani suit, and you're hungry, you want to eat a chicken. The chicken's worth about $10, or I don't know, $15, whatever. I don't know what a chicken's worth. And then probably chickens are very cheap because you buy a whole chicken in the market and there's labor added to it. So how much does a live chicken cost? Yeah, but how much does a live chicken? Has to be even cheaper than that. Anyway, so takinu le rabbanon lishchot ulamatzei hadam beveged umevarech. So he says there is another recourse. You do have another recourse. That if it's a very valuable garment and it's worth much more than the chicken, so then the rabbis gave you a remedy without having to destroy the garment. What you can do is you can shecht the chicken, squeeze out its blood to be absorbed into the fabric, and you make a bracha of al kisui hadam. Uchesheyagia lemakom afar yechabeis habeged sheyetze hadam umechasehu below bracha. And then when you get off the boat and you get to a place where there's earth, you launder the garment over earth so that the absorbed blood drains out of the garment, and you thereby fulfill the mitzvah of kisui hadam by covering the absorbed blood in earth. This is what the Ramah says in Yoredeya Siman Chaf Ches. Ba'ayin sham b'nosei kelim, I refer you to the nosei kelim there, who discuss more of the details of this mitzvah. So there is a possible remedy in a dire situation where the cost of doing kisui hadam is greater than the cost of the bird itself.
No, so maybe I didn't follow that, Rabbi. You then dry clean the garment?
No, you don't dry clean it. You're going to wash it so that the blood will drain out of it. Now, if it's an Armani suit, I'm not sure what to tell you.
Yeah, is the garment savable after it's been blood?
If it's a bed sheet, then it's savable, right? Because you can launder cotton, right? You have to wash it in cold water. You'll get out the blood stain, whatever.
Okay.
Maybe it's a colored sheet. Who knows, right? There are some fabrics that are savable, right? But you have to launder it, and in the course of laundering it, let the runoff of the liquid that is laundering it run into the soil, and then cover it with soil.
So it's not good enough to be covered by the garment. It has to be covered by soil, and to just give you that allowance of the deferral of the.
They give you the allowance covering, as long as it's absorbed into the fabric, so it's not exposed blood,
and can be extracted.
Yeah, it can be extracted later. That's apparently not kisui hadam because it has to be earth or ash. Or they use sawdust in many of the sawdust or wood chips, very small wood chips. I've seen them use as well. Yes, yeah, sand is also good. Yeah, that's all fine for kisui hadam. A number of years ago, I drove cross country with my son, and at the time Rubashkin was still open in Iowa. So we looked on the map. This was long before the period of Waze and Google Maps and stuff. We looked on the map. We saw that if we drove an extra couple of hours, we could stay in Iowa overnight. We booked a motel. It's like the only motel in Postville, Iowa. And I set up an appointment to show my son shechita. And he got nauseous, but anyway. Yeah, but no, it was fine. Okay. So anyway, let's take a look at the biurim over here. Shesorev kisei v'shulchan lihischamein bahem, that you're allowed to, if you need heat, and this is the only thing available, you're allowed to burn a table or a chair. Harav sasam kan lahatir b'chol gavner. So he says the Rav Shulchan Aruch is permissive without any qualification. Umashma de'af im hakisei b'hashulchan shavet pikama me'hanas achinu. The implication being is that even if the chair or the table is worth much more than the benefit of the heat. In other words, typically you could put a valuation price on heat. What would you normally pay for heating? And if the table and chair could often be many times more valuable than the cost of the heating. V'chol adam min hayishuv lo yasa davar zeh l'srov shulchan v'kisei yakar abor chimu ma'at lahana askufa. He says normally people wouldn't do that, to burn very, very expensive furniture in order to keep their body warm. Mikol makom im adam zeh chafetz bazeh eina over al bal tashchis. But the opinion of the Rav Shulchan Aruch is that if you in particular prefer heat over the cost of the furniture, you have permission to do that. In other words, if that's your personal choice, you have a right to do that according to the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Ulam b'Shabbos kut chavtes amad aleph shuhu makor davar zeh isa. He says, but if we go back to the Gemara, which is the source for this, the Gemara states as follows: Amar Shmuel, Heikiz dam v'nitztane. If a person just finished a bloodletting, and the body is compromised. After a bloodletting, they would draw a pint of blood or however much they would draw, and your body would be weak. You need to get back to yourself. So it was very common if you did this in the winter that your body would get chills. And so osin lo medura, afilu b'tekufas tamas. But so therefore, if it's on Shabbos and it's a sakana for the guy, it may present a danger to his health. You're allowed to build a bonfire for him to help him heat himself, even if it's in the middle of the summer and he says, I'm cold. Shmuel tzol takataka deshaga, Rav Yehuda tzol pitora diona. The Gemara then gives two stories, one about Shmuel and one about Rav Yehuda. And it says that they burned these items for these two rabbis after a bloodletting. And Rashi explains, Upirish Rashi, Lo matzu eitzim muchanim lahesek biyom hakaza. They couldn't find firewood normally that they would use, and vitziva ubaku kisei shel tadhar shehu mu'ule b'damim ad kan l'shano. And what they basically did is they took a chair that was made out of wood. It was very valuable. It was a lot of carpentry skill went into it. And they burned the chair in order to provide heat for the person who was having chills after a bloodletting. Umashma lichora the davke hecha sheyesh hechrech ba'asiyas hamedura dahavi yom hakaza v'yeshlachu sheyechle az shari. But the implication of that Gemara is that it's only permitted to burn expensive furniture when a person's health is in question, right? In other words, that was the situation over there, where there was a fear that the person was going to get sick. Avaloli stam hana'a bilvad. But to burn an expensive piece of furniture just because you want the benefit of heat, but you're not in any danger of getting ill, that the Gemara does not seem to permit. And that's the point that he wants to make, is that it would only be permitted based on this Gemara to burn expensive furniture if, there's a concern that if we don't provide heat, people are going to get ill and possibly catch pneumonia or something like that. V'chein mashma b'darchei Moshe, Yoredei, etc. Amu v'leil b'viurim. V'chol heicha de'ahefsid hu gadol mehana yesh bo mishum bal tashchis. He says, and the Rama seems to agree with this, because like we said before, there are opinions that suggest that when the item that is being destroyed is more valuable than like the case of the fabric, more expensive than the chicken, it says you don't have a right to destroy the more valuable item for the less expensive item. But he says, but this seems to be a machlokas, because from the Beis Yosef, no such distinction is drawn. It seems like anytime you want something for utilitarian purposes, even if you're going to be destroying something valuable, you would be allowed to go ahead and destroy it. And we have another Gemara that seems to permit this, because Mar Berei de Ravina Avad Hilula Librei, that the Gemara tells a story over there about Mar Berei de Ravina, who was one of the sages. He made a wedding for his son. Chazanu leRabbanan dahavu kabad chutuva. And he noticed, this is a famous Gemara, as you'll see in just a minute. He noticed that the rabbis were being overly freilich. In other words, there was too much celebration. He was concerned that all of the frivolity would lead to some, perhaps, lead to mixed dancing, right? So, Aisi Kasa de Mokara Bas Arba Meyazuzi, the Tavar Kamaihu, the Iatzivu, Adkan. So he brought out a glass, a very expensive piece of crystal that was worth 400 zuz, which was like a lot of money. And he just smashed it in front of them, and they all became sober as a result. They all became serious as a result. So what do you see from that Gemara? You say, Hare chazinan dechadei lasos ritzono sheratza la'atzev l'rabbanan. There, no one's health was in danger, right? But what you see is that if you have a specific objective, a constructive objective, which here in that story was, this rabbi wanted to bring the rabbis back to their senses. Hey, you guys are laughing too much. Are you having too much of a good time, right? Then, right, the question, of course, is, well, what about Bal Tashchis? What right do you have to destroy this expensive crystal? Apparently, from that Gemara, you see that because it was a constructive objective, which apparently was considered virtuous, don't get too frivolous, right? And so that was the issue. And he quotes the Pri Chadash, and he says, and this proves Zeraya L'Shitas HaBeis Yosef. And he says, and that proves the Beis Yosef's point that it doesn't matter how expensive the item that you're destroying, as long as it's for a constructive purpose, you don't have to make that calculus, like, can I really justify the cost expenditure? We'll skip the parentheses. He says, Achakati yesh la'ayin mehadi isa b'kiddushin daf lamed beis amud aleph. But now let's look at another story, Gemara in Kiddushin. The Rav Huna kara shiroi ba'anpei Rabba Berei. So he says that Rav Huna tore up some shmatas in the presence of Rabba, his son. Amar ezel ichse irasach ilo rasach. So he says, I want to see if my son, why did Rav Huna tear it in front of his son? He did it because he wanted to see if his son would get upset. It was almost like a test to see, like, are you going to lose your cool by seeing your father tear up expensive garments in front of you? So uparach b'gemara v'haka avar mishum bal tashchis. So the Gemara says, but isn't that bal tashchis, just to wantonly tear fabric like that? So mishani da'avad lei b'pun baini. And so the Gemara answers, and Rashi explains what that word b'pun baini means. B'makom hatfira sheno nechsar midamav b'kach kagon b'shulav. That when he tore the garment, it was to tear it on its seam so that it could always be repaired. Okay? And v'lichora kasha, my parach da'avar mishum bal tashchis, harei lo asa kein b'derach hashchasa, ala ratza liros im yir tachilo. You can ask a question, like, why does the Gemara think that this is bal tashchis if I have a constructive objective? I want to test my child's character. Is he going to lose his cool by seeing something that's valuable being torn? Let's say it belongs to the family, it's part of the Yerusha, and he sees I'm tearing it up. Is he going to lose his cool or not? That seems to be a constructive test. Just like in the Gemara in Brachos that talked about the rabbi who broke the expensive crystal because he saw that people were getting too happy, right? What about over here? Isn't this a constructive objective? So it seems like the Gemara over there says that there are times when even when you have a constructive objective, it's not justifiable to just wantonly destroy items. V'yesh lomar dekeven de'inyan habechina sheratz lebachno irasach ilo efshur lasus bahar bedrachim ve'ein tzarich lazeh davka pu'ula shel hashchasa. So perhaps you could answer this question by saying that in the case of the Gemara, where the father tore the garment in the presence of his son, Yes, it was a test. It was for a constructive objective, but I could have tested him in other ways to see what the makeup of his character was. I didn't have to actually destroy something by doing that. And therefore, Lachain Parich de Cover Mishum Bal Tashchish Hayochel Levachano Ba'ofen Acher Beli Hashchasas Beged. In other words, if the father really wanted to test the son's character, he could have figured out other ways to do it without destroying expensive items. We could also suggest that the Beis Yosef only permits destroying things when there's a mitzvah to be accomplished as a result. Well, yeah, right. But although that wouldn't explain. I mean, it would explain the case of the crystal, that when the rabbis were getting too silly, that would be a mitzvah. Perhaps he's arguing that in this case, testing the son to see what his character is maybe was not enough of a justification. You want to argue, Brian, that it was chinuch. So, yeah, that's true. That's true. For educational purposes, we do allow a person. Yeah, so what you're seeing from this biurim, this exercise, is that there are many gray areas in the Isser of Bal Tashchis. Yes, it's true that if you are destroying something for constructive purposes, you can argue that it's not Bal Tashchis, but there are limits to that argument. In other words, like we saw, if you want to uproot a tree because it's blocking your view, you should minimize the amount of destruction. If you want to uproot a tree because you have to build, then there's nothing to talk about. You can't build if you're going to leave the tree stump there. But let's say you just want to make a clearing so your kids can play floor hockey. That's not so simple that you're allowed to uproot a fruit tree for that purpose. That might not be considered sufficient justification to destroy something that provides produce.
Rabbi, it seems like the ultimate is Moshe Rabbeinu destroying the Luchos.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What could be more valuable?
Right. So what could be more valuable? And yet, it's just like that rabbi who destroyed the crystal, the expensive crystal, in order to bring people back to their senses. Moshe felt that this was actually saving the lives of the Jewish people. At least that's the way the Meforshim understand it, is that by destroying the Luchos represented a contract between God and Israel. And if the Jews were in flagrant violation of that contract, they would forfeit their lives. So Moshe destroyed the contract in order to avoid the agreements, so that the Jewish people would be spared. That's one way of at least understanding.
But there's also shock therapy, I suppose, too. Right?
Shock therapy too. Yeah.
Rabbi, what's the schedule for the next couple of days?
So we're gonna learn tomorrow morning. What time is Shacharis tomorrow?
6:30, I think.
So we'll learn we'll do a curtailed learning. You may all want to have a little breakfast before you come to Shir. Take a look. I think the fast begins around 6:15. I think it said.
Yeah, 17. I think something like that.
So have a little bit of something to eat tomorrow morning. We'll learn from 6:10 to 6:25, and then Purim Day we won't learn, and Bezrat Hashem Friday we'll be back. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Moshe, what did you want to say? Regular trees are okay. Only fruit trees. Yeah.